Hello. This is gonna be shoddy as hell because I don't know, I don't really do things like this very well with scripts and stuff. But it is what it is, so you know. I hope this is a pretty good sort of workshop for like how I do home TV activism, which is pretty applicable to like other forms of activism too, street activism, and various other stuff. But obviously, this is sort of more catered to like home TV and like internet outreach and like having a conversation in internet spaces where you don't always sort of like they don't really know why you're there, and you have to sort of like convince them to have a conversation with you, um, and then sort of like convince them to be vegan, I suppose. So like I'll go through like my group of questions that I go through, um, but I'm going to talk about some like basic sort of like advice for doing activism first. Um, so sort of rule number one, in my opinion, of activism is it's really important to try and make this person who you're sort of speaking to not defensive, right? Like if at the moment that you engage their defenses, you're not going to have a productive conversation with them, right? Because all of a sudden, instead of having like an exchange of like views, um, where they can be receptive to like changing their opinion, you've caused them to defend their position, right? And the moment that someone is defending their position, they're invested in being correct instead of being open to being incorrect, right? So it's really important that we try and be as like sort of impartial and sort of non-judgmental and sort of like um, just like gentle with them to begin with as we can, right? Like I appreciate that you know if someone isn't changing their position, then there is some merit in attacking their position if like they're completely and utterly stuck and they're unwilling to move. But I would be hesitant to do that early. I would try and do that as late on as you can once you've sort of confirmed they're not going to change their position. Um, so we do that by just saying like, hey, I don't want to tell you what to do. I don't want to change your mind. I just want to have a conversation that you might not have ever had before, right? And constantly ask them if they've had like this conversation before. Like if like some really good questions to ask are like, do you think this is your fault that you have these views, or do you think you've like grown up in a society where we don't respect animals, right? Because that makes them realize that like you're not attacking them, right? Um, but yeah, like there's a few things that you can do throughout it that like really make them feel um and as soon as you realize that they are defending their position, when they say like I'll never stop eating meat, or when they say like you can't make me, or like things like that, it doesn't always work, but sometimes you can interject and be like, look, this conversation won't be productive unless you don't be defensive. Like, I can see you're getting defensive, and I don't want you to feel that way. I'm just trying to have a conversation with you about like something you've probably never talked about, right? Like it doesn't always work, and a lot of the time they won't. They'll feel like you're trying to trick them to getting their guard down, which basically you are, right? But I've had people walk back from being really, really hostile to being genuinely open about having a conversation because I've like interrupted them in like, whoa, look, I'm not trying to do this. I just want to have a conversation. And ironically, by the end of it, you have convinced them, right? So, you know, that's really important, right? I don't think I've ever had like a really, really hostile conversation where I've screamed at someone and they've gone vegan, right? Like that's not really something that happens. Um, the next thing is like this is a bit cliche, and everyone ever says this. Um, Weirdly enough, I don't think there's any activism organizations that promote anything different, which sort of makes me feel like I'm following like a prescriptive method instead of actually giving good advice. But like it just works, right? The Socratic method just works, right? There's a reason that everyone tells you to do the Socratic method. Don't tell people information, right? It doesn't work, right? Just talking at someone makes them not engage with you and not want to talk to you. Whereas if you ask a question, they find that information on their own, and they are engaging with you, right? If you just talk at someone, they stop listening, right? But if you ask them questions, they're at least thinking and they're at least using their brain, right? So like if someone says like, I need to eat meat for protein, don't say, oh no, you can get your protein from plants. Say, why don't you think you can get protein from plants, right? And yeah, okay, sometimes they give shitter answers than you could just tell them, but the point is they'll believe their answers, right? You know, and they'll have to think, they have to go in their head and think about it, right? So if you say, why don't you think you can get protein from plants? They might just say some cliche shit, right? Or they might just think like, oh, actually you're right, like maybe I could, right? And if they say like, oh, I can't, like there's no protein in plants, say something like, why don't you think beans contain protein, right? And then they might say, oh, actually beans do contain protein, right? Like, or they might try and justify why beans don't, like, but it's usually just better to ask questions, and it means you spend less time talking, right? Because to some extent they don't care about your position, right? Like, we should be, as activists, we should be probing their position, right, and trying to get them to question their position instead of us just trying to prescribe a position to them, right? um there are some times where it's okay to explain information that they just don't understand, right? So if you say like, do you think chickens suffer in like the egg industry? If they say I don't know, right, then you're allowed to tell them, right, because they don't know, right? But just try and keep it short and succinct, right? When we're like talking to them, try and keep it like, try and have like an understanding of things that you can just regurgitate shortly and sweetly, right? So like, if someone says like, to me, they might say, I don't know about egg suffering. I'd say, did you know that we blend male chicks alive at 1 day old, right? It's pretty much all the basics, all the things they need to know in a really short period of time, right? So yeah, try and ask questions. The next thing is you, right? So it's really important that like you don't make them feel defensive. You ask questions, but then it's really important as well that you are sort of assertive and relatable, and you can generate some amount of respect from this person, right? Because um, the assertiveness is important because we don't want to like placate them, right? The point of us like talking to them isn't to make them feel good about their position, right? It's to make them feel safe, but to ask assertive questions, right? We're supposed to be in charge of the conversation. We're supposed to like conduct the conversation and sort of force them to keep answering questions, right? By keep asking those questions, right? And don't let them go off topic, right? If they randomly go on a tangent, be like, hey, why have we moved topic? Be like, hey, let's go back to the topic I asked. If they start questioning you, be like, it doesn't matter about me. Let's talk about you, right? A lot of people will ask me about my gender, my identity, me as a trans woman. And if I'm in the middle of a veganism conversation, I'll say, hey, I don't want to talk about that. Let's talk about this. We can talk about that later, right? Or sometimes I'll just say, hey, let's talk about this instead, right? Don't let them move the topic away, right? But don't do it in a dick way. It's important to like be both assertive but not like hostile, right? Um, the second one is relatable. Like, it's really, really important that they see you, so they see themselves in you. The moment that they say things that you can relate to, tell them, right? When they say to you, I really like the taste of meat, say, yes, me too. But I didn't go vegan because I stopped liking the taste of meat, right? The moment they say, I've done this all my life, say, yes, I used to eat meat for 28 years, right? Like, if you can say yes to something that they say it, right? And be genuine, right? Because it's really important. They go, oh shit, you're like me, right? Because the moment that they can see, like, um, like what their experience in your past, then they realize that your present can be their future, right? And that's what we want, right? We want people to understand that the vegans in the room are just like the non-vegans. We're just further along, right? We've thought about the things that they've not yet had the benefit to think about, right? Um, and I think it's important to understand that, right? When people like say like, why are you having this conversation? Like, why are you asking these questions? I think it's really important to understand, to like say, because I had this conversation and that's why I'm vegan, right? Like, it's important to make people understand that you didn't go vegan because you were told to go vegan. You went vegan because someone asked you about your position, right? About what you believed, and you realized that it made sense within your beliefs to go vegan, right? You know? And then the last one's respected, right? Like, if there's something you have that you can use to generate respect from this other person, do so, right? Like, it's way easier to make someone vegan if they think you're a fucking superhero, right? Like, I'm trans. right? I run around visibly as a trans woman. When I meet other trans people, they see me and they think, fuck, this person's like advocating for me. I'm more inclined to listen to them, right? I constantly tell people that I'm an ultra marathon runner because that way they're like, shit, she does exercise. She knows about exercise, right? Um, you know, if you can make people laugh, make them laugh. If you can make people cry, make them cry, right? Make them like feel some connection to you by having an effect on them, right? Like, and you know, I think the least like useful effect you can have is to piss them off, right? But if everything else fails and they refuse to like change their position, like say something that fucking hurts, right? But don't say something that hurts in like a fucking like needlessly silly way, right? Don't call them like ugly or something. Say like, you know, if the last thing you can say to someone is like, um, you know, why don't you care about animals? And they say, I just don't. Say like, well, I don't think that makes you worth talking to then, and walk off, right? Like if that's the only thing you can um, do that, right? But if you can make them like you, um, and you can make them willing to like introspect, um, they're more likely to actually go vegan because of the fact that they think, you know, you're worth respecting. But don't placate, obviously. Back to step one. Don't placate people. You don't get respect by like giving false compliments. It's just silly. Um, right then. So, um, engaging with people about this fucking topic on the internet is hard, right? It's really, really hard. And the reason it's hard is because people are on the internet for various reasons. Very, very, very few of them are on the internet to have an ethical discussion about animal rights. They're just fucking not. Right? So getting their attention will be really difficult, right? And getting them to even listen to your questions will also be really difficult, right? Um, it's become a bit of a meme on you know various Discord servers I'm a part of that I will constantly ask people if I can ask them a funny question, right? Because if you say to someone, "Hey, can I ask you a funny question?" their ears prick up and they're like, "Ooh, what's that? I'm intrigued," right? Um, and they will listen to your question, right? So I will start almost all of my activism conversations with, "Hey, can I ask you a funny question?" And they'll go, "Oh, yeah, okay," right? And then I'll say, "What do you think about animal exploitation?" Right? I don't know if this is the best question. I did AV a couple of months ago, and they were raving about animal exploitation, and I just decided that I was going to run with it and use that as my first question for a bit and see how I went. It went pretty well. I think the reason I use this as my first question is because almost everyone will say, "What's that?" Right? What does that mean? Right? Or they'll say, "That sounds bad." Right? Um, but usually they ask me to explain what that is, and there is some merit to then following that up with animal exploitation is where we use an animal for our benefit, regardless of the animal's wants and needs, right? Because even if they don't have the conversation with you, you've just explained what animal exploitation is, which is the thing we as vegans are against, right? So you've explained the vegan position, right? Pretty succinctly, and you might end up doing that to thousands of people, right? And that's okay on its own, right? Especially if like they end up thinking about that again, right? Um, what will usually happen is people will say that's bad and that they don't like animal exploitation, right? Um, which is good, right? But they don't actually mean that because they haven't yet really realized what that means, right? You like if people realize what it means, they'll say, "Do you mean eating meat?" Or like, "Are you a vegan?" Sometimes, right? And then you can just be like, "Yeah, that is a form of exploitation, and yeah, I am a vegan," right? And you can just be honest up front and say, "I just want to have a conversation with you about that," right? Hopefully they let you do it. Sometimes they won't. That's fine. Um, but yeah, what will usually happen is they say, "Yeah, animal exploitation is bad." I don't agree with it. And what they mean is like animal testing in zoos and like kicking dogs, right? That's what they mean. They don't realize they mean eating meat, right? So usually what I ask, and this is like quite a confusing and unpopular question that I ask, is okay, can I ask you a funny question or can I ask you a difficult question? And then I'll say, are you a vegetarian? right? And some people will pretend that they are because they've realized that it's hypocritical to be against animal exploitation and eat meat, and they just don't want to engage in the conversation, right? That's a hard thing to try and get them back to not being defensive and engaging in the conversation. If you can do that, try and do that, right? If you realize they're lying to you, um, what I usually do is if they say yes to being vegetarian, I say, "Oh, are you vegan?" And if they say yes to that, I say, "Why didn't you say you were vegan when I asked if you were vegetarian? Are you lying to me?" It doesn't matter. Like, if you are, I just want to be having an honest conversation with you. So you try and roll it back and get rid of the defensiveness. But this moment when you say, "Are you vegetarian?" that is the main point of contention where they're going to start feeling defensive. Um, and that's why I say vegetarian, because vegetarian is a word that is less stigmatized than vegan, um, and it's more normalized, right? People will constantly say, "I could be a vegetarian, but I couldn't be a vegan." So if you start with the vegetarian, and you just talk about animals from that perspective, you can lead into other things later, right? And it sort of eases you in without triggering the defenses, right? Because that's what we want to do. We don't want to trigger their defenses, right? Obviously, if you're doing this on the street with footage of dead animals, you don't have to worry about that as much. But when you're doing it on the internet, it's really important to not trigger those defenses, because they'll just move on, or they'll start screaming at you. Um, so if they do admit that they're not a vegetarian and that they do eat animals, we say sort of things like, "Hey, can we have a conversation about like," or you say like, either like, "Have you ever discussed whether or not you should eat meat?" Or like, "Can we have a conversation about the fact that you do eat meat?" Or like, just something to say that like this is just a polite conversation. It's not, you know. And if they say yes, the very first question that I'll open with, which if I have a TV screen with dead animals on, this is the first conversation I would ever ask at like an in-person event. But obviously on the internet, we have to work harder to get there. So the very first question I ever ask after that point is, do we need to eat animals or do we choose to eat animals? Right? Because if they think they need to eat animals, it's pointless discussing whether or not they should, right? Like, you wouldn't discuss whether or not someone should breathe oxygen, right? It would just be pointless, right? So this is like my first question always, because it's like vitally important that you agree that this is entirely like needless, um, at the very very start, to avoid just like having two separate conversations, right? Um, and if they'll agree to that, um, then you can say like, okay, and if we choose to, and we know that they suffer by choosing to, why wouldn't we choose not to, right? You know, um, at this point in the conversation, you're basically going to be going through like all the various vegan arguments, which you probably know. I probably don't need to tell you those, right? There's going to be things like, "But lions, though." There's going to be, "We've always done it, though." There's going to be all these like things that they say. Um, I would usually try and have a witty answer for all of them that is a question. If someone says lions do it though, you say, "Yeah, but what would happen to a lion if they didn't eat meat?" Right? And they'll usually say the lion would die. And you say, "Yeah, and you wouldn't, right? You could just eat carrots," right? Or you say like, if they say, "We've always done it," you say like, I don't know, um, what would I say to that? Uh, I would say like, has there been other things in our history that we always did that were bad and we now don't do? Something like that. Um, so if they'll agree that like that's a choice that they could not make, um, like say why like could you make that choice? Could you go vegan? Right? Hopefully at this point they've realized you're vegan. If not, you might want to say vegetarian or vegan, right? You might want to like introduce some amounts of like eggs and dairy prior to that, so that they understand that eggs and dairy is bad too. Usually at some point in the conversation, they will ask, "Hey, are you a vegetarian?" And that's a good point to say like, "Oh no, I'm vegan." Right? And it's that they've asked you then, so you don't have to like tell them you're vegan, because people are very sensitive, and we're trying to not make them defensive. Um, and if they say yeah, they could go vegan. If you say, "Hey, what's stopping you being vegan?" Right? Um, and you answer all their questions about nutrition or whatever questions they have, right? If you get to the point where you've dealt with all that, you say like, why don't you go vegan, right? Um, and this is sort of the point where like you've got them totally in agreement. Like if they've answered all your questions properly, um, and they completely agree with you, right? And like they basically have all the principles to be vegan. You say like, why don't you go? Like, why is today not day one that you go vegan, right? You like prompt them to do it today, right? And you basically, if you say why is today not the day that you go like day one vegan, they have to give you a reason, like why not, right? And they'll probably say like reductionism or all this other stuff, and you'll be like, hey, if you were in that position, would you want me to beat you less, or would you want me to stop beating you, right? Like something like that, right? I think it's important to understand that like this won't always work. Like, this set of questions that I've given you is the questions I use, and there's going to be a big pile of like excuses in there, and like giving people information or asking people about like to probe themselves for information about the various different excuses they use or the different reasons that they might not think they could be vegan. um but a really vital thing that I sort of missed at the start, um is that I don't think we make vegans by convincing people who don't give a fuck about animals to give a fuck about animals. Right? I think that's a waste of time. I think you'll just end up arguing for hours and hours with people who just don't give a fuck, right? And what we should sort of be trying to do is find the people who do give a fuck and push them to go vegan, right? Push them to go vegan today by probing them with like assertive questions, and then if they do agree with you, asserting that they should do something about it, right? And if at any point in this entire like sort of tree of questions you're going into a loop, or they're just being really, really defensive, or they're flat out saying they don't give a fuck about animals, move on, right? Leave them with a statement that sort of makes them realize that you think their position is like immoral, like or silly, or like doesn't make sense, and move on. So like if someone says like if someone's being like pointlessly argumentative with you and just being really defensive, I would just say something like, "Hey, I'm just trying to have a conversation. We can't really like um, have a conversation if you're just constantly trying to defend your position. So I'm gonna move on because I feel like I'm just upsetting you and you're not really listening to me, right?" And that might prompt them to sort of like wonder why they're being upset by you, right? Wonder why you just trying to have this conversation is like making them feel so like defensive, right? If they're going in circles, it's the same, right? You just say, "Hey, I'm just trying to have a conversation with you, but you don't really seem to be listening to me," and you just keep going back to the exact same point over again, even though I've basically given you a reason why that point doesn't matter, right? Or even though you agree with me that we shouldn't harm animals, for some reason you'd believe that certain animals it's totally okay to sort of harm, and there doesn't really seem to be any sense why. Um, or if they just say they don't care about animals, I usually prompt them to say something ridiculous. So I'll say like, "Hey, would you be okay with me, drowning a cow in boiling water, provided I ate them, right?" Or I'll say like, if you just don't care about animals, or if you don't care about human, or whatever they've blatantly stated they don't care about, because sometimes people say they don't care about humans as well. Like people say it's okay to be racist and stuff sometimes, and you just say, "Hey, I don't think there's any point me discussing whether or not we should harm animals with you if you don't even think it's okay to like if you think it's okay to just like be blatantly racist or like something like that, right?" Like it basically make people realize that you're moving on because they're a waste of your time, right? And I think it's really important to give off the impression that they've not upset you, you're not like angry with them, you don't feel offended by any of the dumb things they've said, you just don't care about them enough to continue like giving them your time. Because I think things like that, even though it's probably very rare, that assertiveness and that sort of like level of like disregard for them will like live with them, right? They'll feel like, um, why weren't they worth your time? Why couldn't they hurt you by eating meat in front of you or whatever, right? Um, but yeah, I mean that's basically it. Um, we make vegans by just investing time, and just having a pretty good approach that's like replicable, and just doing it over and over and over again, right? Just having the same conversation, a conversation that's pretty good with as many people as possible, right? Um, so please do, right? Like that's the most important part. Go on the Omegle bot or the Own bot, sorry. Go on whatever like sort of internet outreach um thing you have, even if that means making an Own TV account and just doing it on your own, right? Um, just have a go, right? It is really easy. It's a bit draining, um, but the more good conversations you have, the more you get, you feel better about it. Um, but yeah, thanks for listening. I hope this helped. Um, Please do reach out if you have any questions, and I'll put the list of questions that I use and some witty responses that I have in the description. Um, Good luck. Make some vegans.